So in order to identify a network class, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the IP address and you're going to look at the first octet. So for example, the first octet, like if you have a 192.168.0.1 or whatever, the first octet means the 192. So you have 4 octets in an IP address. So for example, the first octet would be 192, the second would be 168, the third octet would be 0, and then the fourth octet would be 1 or whatever the number is. So you're going to look at the first octet. So the range for Class A networks is 1 through 126. Technically speaking, it's 1 through 127, but 127 is used as a loopback address, so it's not used for networks and whatnot. So your Class B networks are going to have the number between 128 and 191 in the first octet, and your Class C networks are going to have a number between 192 and 223 in the first octet. So I'm going to give some examples of that. So one last thing is that for Class A networks, the typical CIDR notation or a subnet mask for a Class A network is /8. For Class B networks, the typical CIDR notation is /16. And finally, for Class C networks, the typical CIDR notation is /24. And we'll get to more what that means in a minute. But for now, just try to remember that Class A is typically /8, Class B is typically /16, and Class C is typically /24. Alright? Now, so for example, I'm going to write out a few addresses, right? I'm going to write out a few addresses. Write this out. Okay, I'm going to write that out. And I would like if you could figure out what class of networks we have here based on the first octet of their address. So remember, the first octet is right here. It's this digit right here. This is the first octet, this is the second, this is the third, and this is the fourth. So if you want to go ahead and pause and see if you can figure out which class of networks they are, go ahead and be my guest. I will give you a minute to pause, and then I will resume speaking. Okay, so if you said that the 10.0.1.5 is a Class A network, you are correct. It is Class A. Notice the number in the first octet. Is it between 1 and 126? It is 10. It falls under 10. So that means it's Class A. Now for the second network, right? What does the first octet fall under? It falls under 172. Okay? If you look up here at Class B, as you can see, it's between a number between 128 and 191. Okay, so it is a Class B network. Now let's look at the third address. Does it fall between 192 and 223? Yes, the first octet has 192. So we know that this is a Class C network, right? All right, so now we identified these, and if you remember what I said earlier, Class A is typically a /8. Class B is typically a /16. Here, let me typically a /16. And the CIDR notation for Class C is typically /24. Now I've been saying typically. The reason I say typically is because I'm going to go a little bit into about subnetting here in a minute, but first and foremost, I want you to know that even though this first octet is 192, and you can identify the address as being Class C, the subnet mask itself can actually, when we're working with subnetting, it actually can be like a class, you can have like a class C IP address, like a 192, but you can subnet it as a class A. So what I mean by that is you can have like a 192.168.42.32, just numbers, whatever. And then even though that this is a class C IP address, so usually we put the slash in the front for the subnet mask. So it would usually be read out like this. So 192.168.32.6/8. So that /8's our CIDR notation. So it's a class C IP address, but it's actually it's actually subnetted as a class A address. Yeah, it's actually subnetted as if it's the typical class A address. So you might just want to take a note, put a note down somewhere, and realize that, because that's pretty important. That's going to play a role in how you subnet your network.